Welcome, everyone. My name is Lauren Van Schilfgaarde. I'm with the Tribal Law and Policy Institute, and welcome to our webinar, finally, Fiscal Year 2018, the Comprehensive Opioid Abuse Program, Funding Opportunities for Tribes. I believe, as many of you know, this webinar was originally scheduled for May 2nd, but because the solicitation hadn't come out yet, we postponed it, and thankfully it has come out now. This is a brand new solicitation. This is only its second year, but even more noteworthy, there is a significant amount of additional funding this year, and so it is ripe for our proposals. So we are going to go over this application today to hopefully better empower you to put a proposal together. So I will be doing the bulk of the content today. I'm Lauren, Tribal Law Specialist at the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. I'm a member of the Coach du Pueblo, and I am originally from Albuquerque, New Mexico, but am now in Los Angeles with the Tribal Law and Policy Institute. We are also very fortunate today to have several representatives from the Bureau of Justice Assistance Office of Justice Programs. In no particular order, we have Timothy Jeffries, who is a Senior Policy Advisor with BJA on the line. Hi, Tim.
Hey, how are you?
Very good. Thank you for joining us. We also have, and I apologize, I just found out that you were joining us just a minute before, and so I didn't have a chance to add you to our presenters list, Julius Dupree. Hi, Julius. Oh, you might be on mute. Well, hopefully we can get, oh, hi.
Hi, this is Julius, Lauren. Hi.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure.
And I believe that Norina Henry and Trish Saxton will also be joining us, but they haven't called in yet, but we will let you know when they are able to join us. But for our attendees, keep in mind that both Julius and Tim are on the line. They are with BJA. They helped put this solicitation together. They're going to be fostering the whole application process. So if you have any questions, these are the people you want to direct your questions to. Because I didn't know Julius was going to be on, I neglected to include his contact information on here. But when we send out the webinar recording and the webinar slides, I'll update his contact information so that it's on there. Speaking of what is going to be on the website, I had intended to include these two things in the handouts, but apparently you cannot modify the handouts after you started the webinar, and I was so last minute that I didn't know that. So these are live links. You can click on them right here on your screen. The top one is the webinar slides. That is this PDF version of the PowerPoint slides. So go ahead and click on that, and you will be able to follow along or go back if you'd like. But don't worry, I will also be posting these webinar slides on wellnesscourts.org so that you can access them whenever you'd like. And if for some reason that doesn't work, you can always email me and I'll be happy to send them to you. And then this bottom link is the RFP, the one that we will be discussing today, the Comprehensive Opioid Abuse Program RFP. So both of those links are live. And like I said, I'll be posting them as well. Okay,
hey, Lauren.
A little background. Yeah.
I just wanted to jump in and give a really quick introduction and thank you from the Tribal Law and Policy Institute and all of the folks calling in. As Lauren mentioned, this was rescheduled several times. We really wanted to make sure that we had the most accurate and up-to-date information, and we wanted to put this solicitation out as soon as we got the updated information and the webinar coordinated together. There's a lot of money, and I know you're going to cover this, but we really wanted to stress on behalf of the BJA director and all of our tribal senior and policy advisors, there's a lot of funding that's coming out. We went from $13 million to $145 million, and there's a lot of money in different categories. We really wanted to make this opportunity for you to ask questions and be thinking about ways and areas where you can request funding for your programs. We actually just met yesterday, and we, meaning Julius Dupree, Trish Saxton, Norina, and myself, and all of the senior policy advisors and associate deputy directors within BJA associated with tribal programs. And they really are on board to see if you have questions that don't necessarily fit within this COAP solicitation, and you kind of have questions on what you want to apply for under CTAS or other areas. So everybody's kind of here from our team to make sure that we can make this as easy as seamless as possible. We apologize for the lateness of this getting out. We know that it's kind of late in the year and there's a lot of other solicitations all hitting at once. And we also apologize because it's only going to be out for 30 days. So we don't want to deter you from applying for these funds because everyone will be in the same position, whether you're a tribe, a state, a local or a county or district, everybody will have the same 30 days to put an application together. And lastly, I just want to point out is we are really looking at our peer reviewers and making sure that we are gearing up our peer reviewers to know tribal programming and tribal specific resources. So we really want to make sure that this is an equal and fair opportunity for all of the folks who apply for this application. That's it. I want to turn it back over. Sorry for that introduction.
No, introductions are good. Julius, did you have anything that you would like to add?
Oh, no, thanks anyway, Lauren. Appreciate it.
Sure. All right, well, moving right along. So a little introduction. I have had to do a deep dive into this solicitation because, like you, this is my first time really engaging with this solicitation. So this was my attempt to try and organize the information. So hopefully it's helpful for you, but if not, I'm sure there are other ways to look at this, so don't panic. This solicitation is primarily in response to the Comprehensive Addiction and Recovery Act that Congress passed in 2016. The purpose of that act was to directly address the opioid epidemic through a variety of different strategies, including prevention, education, and services. However, this is not just CARA. It is also combined with the pre-existing act, the Harold Rogers Prescription Drug Monitoring Program that was passed back in 2002. And that was all about the prescription drug monitoring programs that may or may not exist in your state. So what they've done is there are 6 different categories that you can apply for in this grant. 1 through 4 stem from the CARA Act, and 5 and 6 are part of the old prescription drug monitoring program. So if you're familiar with those, then 5 and 6 should look familiar. Okay, where is this solicitation? It was just released last week, or this week rather, May 8th. And as Tim mentioned, it's an incredibly short turnaround. It's due June 7th. As some of you, I think, are also aware, the adult drug court solicitation is out with the deadline, I think, June 13th. I have it right here. June 5th. So some of us are going to be doing double duty, cancel your plans, whatever you're doing. For those of you that are going to be at the NADCP training in Houston, we'll all be huddled together doing some grant writing together. It's going to be a great time. It's going to be a little bit stressful, but hopefully we can all get through it because also, as Tim mentioned, there's a lot more money here that they are itching to give to us. So CARA was in direct response to the opioid epidemic. In the solicitation, they have pointed to some specific findings around the opioid epidemic that are noteworthy, both for why the solicitation exists, but also how are we a part of this. So this is a number that I see in the paper probably every day, that in 2016, there were over 63,000 overdose deaths. I think that it's pretty safe to say this is part of why the opioid epidemic is so loud. It's not just that people are increasingly becoming addicted to the substance, is that they're dying at a really devastating rate. In 2014, the number of people that had a substance abuse disorder was staggeringly high, and a significant portion of that number was from just heroin, which is a huge rise seen in past years. One difference between this year's solicitation and last year's is a pretty marked focus on the effects that the opioid epidemic has on children and families. I just want to point that out for those of you that did apply last year. There is a much bigger emphasis on children and families and a much bigger opportunity to engage child welfare services. So this is a snapshot of the National Congress of American Indians policy research publication on the opioid epidemic. I want to put this out there as a potentially good resource for you to use in your proposal. They have some great findings about how the opioid epidemic has affected Indian country. So this is some of their findings from the Centers for Disease Control on the drug poisoning deaths facing American Indians. And this is some of their findings just generally. There was a news report that came out, I believe in December, that identified American Indians and Alaska Natives as being the most devastated ethnic population in the country for overdose deaths. What's also interesting, I'm going to go to the next slide. So on here, this is a live link for this article if you'd like to link to it. Is that this is not necessarily true for all American Indian communities in the country. The truth is it's hitting different communities in different ways. Some communities I know are ground zero for the opioid epidemic, facing staggering numbers. Every single person in their wellness court is facing an opioid addiction. This is right for them. Other communities, it is, there's no opioids whatsoever. It's still methamphetamines. It's still alcohol. And many, many communities, it's a combination that, especially on the West Coast, we're not facing quite the devastating levels of fentanyl-infused heroin that we are on the East Coast, and so we don't have quite the devastating overdose deaths that you see on the East Coast, but there is still prescription drug abuse, prescription drug diversion issues, and so I see that everywhere. It may or may not be the same for your community. I highly encourage you to hook up with your court data, with your law enforcement arrest data, and with your treatment providers to see what their admissions rates are to get a grip on what exactly are the drugs of choice facing our community. So the solicitation has a nice little introduction about what the opioid epidemic was and what the factors they see that lead to addiction. I think we can all agree that these are true, but I want to highlight them as just things that they've highlighted that we want to be sure to highlight in our own application. Poverty and economic instability, a decreased ability to parent. There's our emphasis on child welfare again. A range of physical, mental, and behavioral health ailments. This is certainly going to go into our strategies for addressing the opioid epidemic. And then finally, trauma, including exposure to violence and victimization. As we'll see, this has been directly played out in one of the categories of funding that they're offering, which I think is incredibly interesting and different from last year. Okay, so what are some of the different things that they want to fund under this Comprehensive Opioid Abuse Program? It's both relatively broad, but also as I read it, I see some very specific strategies that they're willing to fund under here. And so it's not everything under the sun. They have specific ideas of things that you can choose from. It's a pretty high emphasis on engaging with law enforcement. They want early intervention, early diversion from the justice system if possible, lots of cross-system planning and coordination. Pretty much every category wants to see the engagement of a multidisciplinary team of stakeholders. Lots of engagement with treatment. They specifically identify engaging with rural and tribal communities as far as expanding access to treatment, including telemedicine if relevant. They identify quote, high frequency utilizers that when you're thinking about who you want to target for your interventions, it's not necessarily all addicts, but those who are frequently coming through the system or the revolving door. And then finally, as I think we're seeing in pretty much all DOJ applications now, they want to see communities leverage their data sets, which is what I was just referencing in leveraging our own tribal data sets about what drugs of choice our community is facing. There is, in fact, an entire category about enhancing our capacity to do just that. So some themes that have pulled out. Again, this was just my anecdotal pulling out of themes, although Tim helped me identify a couple but more. Children and families. This is huge. In addressing the opioid epidemic, it's no longer sufficient to just individualize the addict, which was great for Indian country because honestly, I think tribes have been at the forefront of doing just that, of providing a family-focused approach into our services. And so it's great to see that this is being emphasized on a much larger national scale. There's a whole category section specifically for victim services, which is new compared to last year and part of a partnership with the Office for Victims of Crime. Huge emphasis on first responders, on responding to the fatal overdose, on rural communities, and then as we'll see later on, a big emphasis on engaging a research partner. Shout out to any communities out there that currently have a research partner on a various project. Go link arms with them and see if they want to engage you with this project too. It's really hard, I think, to develop those relationships right at the get-go, and it may be a little ambitious to do that for this proposal, but don't let me stop you. If you want to go do make this part of a research project for which you will get priority consideration, do it. Heck yeah. Okay, sequential intercept model. This was played up a little bit heavier in last year's solicitation, but it's still very much in this one. This is in reference to a particular tool that they link in the RFP about how to sort of think about and engage the various points in our justice system. And this is specifically when we talk about where we want to target our resources. So on the first part, they have different service providers that should be part of our, thinking both about the sequential intercept model, but also our multidisciplinary teams. So are these groups that you interact with? Because my interaction with many of you is via a healing to wellness court, then I know that the answer is yes. These are people that are already serving on your teams. They're already serving on your steering committees or advisory committees for your teams. These are people that you have regular conversations with. If they're not, maybe it's a good time to pick up the phone. It doesn't necessarily have to be all of these entities, though I think to the extent possible, it would enhance both your proposal, but also your project. Okay, and finally, the sequential intercept model. This is just a snapshot that I took of the much larger sort of graphic that they have on here. But as you can see here, they've broken it up into 5 different intercepts. And so when they talk about, they want early intervention, early diversion, you can see intercept 1, law enforcement. This is pre-arrest that we want to take this first contact that a person might have with the criminal justice system and target our services there. Or are our services going to be targeted more at arrest, where it's pre-court, but they now have a formal contact with the justice system, and so maybe we're going to target our services at arraignment. Versus intercept 5, where now they're being released from prison, released from jail. We have an intense supervision setup. Where can we target our services there? So I bring this up just so that you can become familiar with the language when they're talking about intercept 1 versus intercept 4, what they mean by these, and also to encourage you, especially for category 3, there's specific reference to the sequential intercept model. So you're encouraged to talk about your system using this language. Apparently when this came out, they did a little addendum, and so they've added Intercept 0 now, which is a separate publication. It's not a publication, it's like a brochure. You're seeing like half of the brochure, so don't be worried, it's not expensive reading. But Category 1 specifically talks about first responders, and so it's clear they wanted to identify this Intercept 0 that may even be pre-police calling 911, but that there's definitely still interaction with the system going on. A couple recommended resources. As we see in most of our DOJ solicitations now, we're encouraged to visit SAMHSA's Guide to Evidence-Based Practices. Still a great resource. That's on the bottom one. I have this top one asterisk, this Finding Solutions to the Prescription Opioid and Heroin Crisis. This was present in last year's solicitation, but not in this year's. But it still seemed to me like an interesting resource. It's a roadmap for states. So you'll notice it does not envision engaging with tribes, but I still thought it was kind of helpful to just sort of get a grip on what some of the bigger national strategies have been for the opioid crisis, so you can think about how yours might fit into that national strategy. Tim, I wonder if you have a thought on why this wasn't included, or if it's still a good resource.
It's still a good resource. I think we just gave the flavor in the introduction of the first year, where folks wanted to coordinate or maybe state-specific strategy or align with what the state is doing. But yeah, it's still a good resource.
Okay, great, thanks. Oops, oh no, I clicked on the link and I didn't mean to. Oh no. Sorry, everyone. I broke my computer.
I did want to mention while you were looking at that and updating the slide, if we think about a couple of slides back, we really did push those priorities. So when Lauren mentioned the different themes, we really wanted to note the priorities that were set forth from the administration and from Congress. So rural communities was something that BJA was told that we had to put a priority on our funding to support rural communities. So that's where that came from. Also, developing a research partner with your program or action research partnership is something that we highlighted as well, because those were areas where we deemed they were most effective in program.
Oh, that's really helpful. So as I noted, there's a priority for those who are ambitious enough to engage an action researcher. I know I'm particularly interested in seeing tribal communities do this. There is a confession that there's just a lot out there about what strategies may or may not work in communities. We just don't know. We need specific research to show that a particular intervention is in fact effective for a certain community. But just because it's effective in Milwaukee doesn't mean it's going to be effective in our tribal community. And so because of that, BJA has identified the 3 categories for which we're eligible, tribes, priorities for those that do an action researcher. You're not required to do this, but it sure would be cool if you did. Here's another resource that was present in last year's solicitation that's not in this year's, this BJA Smart Suite initiative. I put it on here still because even though you're not required to make reference to it in your action researcher portion of your proposal, I thought it still had some good resources, including the stuff on performance measures. For those of us that don't have a PhD in evaluation, I found this sort of quick, Research 101 resource really useful.
So we changed the name of that. It's a slightly different resource. The key elements in the narrative and the information in there is still relevant. I think it's called Innovations. So it's the name is no longer Smart Suite. So we can provide an updated link to that, or let you guys know if you really need that resource, what the new name for that, because that is very important. Thank you for bringing that up, Lauren.
Sure, yeah, I'll put a little star in my notes that I'll put that updated link along with all of the webinar resources. Okay, so eligibility. I wanted to just put this out there so you can get a nice snapshot of what the whole proposal is, but we'll only be talking about categories 1, 3, and 6, because as you can see, those are the only categories for which tribes are eligible. Categories 2 and 4 are for state initiatives. And so I wanted to put that out there in case your state is funded. You'll want to know about that because they'll have resources that will affect you in their whole state strategies. And then category 5 is again for states that have prescription data monitoring programs, or those that don't. I highlighted here, for those that don't, they allow cities, counties, and regions to apply, but I asked, tribes that still aren't eligible for that one. So go ahead and cross 5 off your list, but we are eligible for 6. Okay. Oh, we already did research partner. So here's just some information you'll need for your research partner proposal, including the experience of your research partner. They want somebody who is actually adept in doing these kinds of evaluations. Universities are usually, I think, your best resource, particularly because they're local. But there's a couple organizations out there that we often do work with that specialize in this kind of evaluation as well. Okay, category 1. By the way, I just wanted to jazz up this PowerPoint, so I included pictures that I really liked. This is a picture of Chaco Canyon in New Mexico, but it doesn't necessarily have any relationship to category 1 first responders. Just want to point that out. So funding levels. This is for 24 months. There's 2 categories here, 1A and 1B. You can apply for both. In fact, the solicitation explicitly encourages you to apply for both. So 1A, you can apply for, let's see, so this was no less than, so the top level, the ceiling of $500,000, 1B up to $800,000. However, at least $400,000 of that $800,000 has to go directly to victim services. So that's what those little symbols mean. First responder.
Do you have some ideas of what types of victim services they might want to request funding for if they're thinking about how they can maximize those dollars?
Do I personally?
Yeah.
Well, I put some stuff on here, but when I saw the victim services, I immediately was thinking about child welfare. I've been working with quite a few family healing to wellness courts lately, and that seemed like a really ripe opportunity to hook up with tribal social services and just see what's been on their wish list. Especially, for parents that are substance abusing, it's incredibly traumatizing when kids are removed from the home for both the kids and the parents and the whole family. Are there children's services that we need? Do we need trauma interventions as part of our substance abuse counseling? I know some communities have, it's really common for kin to take the out-of-home placement, and we often have services for foster care parents who are not relatives, but we sometimes have fewer resources for relatives that take those placements, so maybe like grandparents training or something like that. That's where my mind went. I wonder, Tim, if you were thinking about other stuff.
Exactly, and I thought those were key points, and especially relative to the areas we're particularly looking at the victims of the overdose person and who is affected by that, and also providing additional services. As you've probably seen on the news and the television, a lot of people are affected by the person of overdose, so whether it would be the grandparents having to take care of the grandchildren or some other type of scenario. So those all that you mentioned were extremely good examples.
Okay, and I think that's another good just example right there of, while this is targeting like the first responder, it's intended, to provide services at that Intercept 0. You can get pretty creative in how you want to interpret victim services. And, really, and I think that your proposal would really benefit from, look, our community has been doing some strategic planning about where the gaps in our services have been for a couple of years now. This opioid crisis has just exacerbated what those gaps are. And so we want to use this funding to address those gaps because the people in our community facing this opioid crisis the victimization issues are just getting bold and highlighted. So as I mentioned, this is first responder, and so we want to target our services for as early in the intercept as possible. It's a specific targeting for low-level, non-violent offenses, and they want to see you connecting your substance abuse and behavioral health programs. So again, those wellness court partnerships that already exist, really great to leverage here. I think all of these categories require a project coordinator, and so the project coordinator needs to be dedicated to this program, and so they actually put a minimum that 50% of this project coordinator's time needs to be devoted to this project. So it's anticipated that your budget will include a project coordinator for at least 50% of their time. So I put that on there just because that's not terribly common, but I think it's a great idea because these are pretty intensive projects. So here they have some examples of the type of first responder initiatives that other communities have done. These are often law enforcement projects. So they're coming out of the police department, and they're usually around, okay, look, the typical process was that we find someone who we've been called to a home, we've been called to a parking lot, or we just come across someone who is suffering an overdose or is openly using or whatever. There was an incident, and we arrest them and we engage them with treatment while they're in the jail, and it's not a terribly effective system. So what if instead of arresting them, we actually diverted them to services right there at that initial contact, or have a unit that is specifically dedicated to overdose or other using type issues. And so it usually is like a partnership of law enforcement and paramedics or things like that. So these are just a couple examples of those types of initiatives that people have done. The RFP linked to this LEAD program, but actually when I Googled a lot of these, when I Googled the first one, PARI and DART, websites popped up about those initiatives. They stem from communities around the country that have developed these. And if you're interested, it's intended to, copy and paste. Take what you think would work for your community. However, for LEAD, it looks like Congress was particularly impressed with that one. And so a minimum of $2.5 million is going to be allocated to proposals that specifically propose to implement LEAD. So if that looks at all appetizing, that seems like a good one to implement. Okay, some allowable uses, some allowable projects that you could do. Connect at-risk survivors of overdose and people that are at risk of overdose and their families with services. Provide access to recovery support, again, anywhere early in those intercepts. Provide targeted access to detox for those that are suffering overdose or at risk. And then just do a general community education project. So these were 4 big things that were identified for both that you could use this funding for. They are these I think are examples of, they're pretty specific, but they're also pretty broad, right? This is an opioid RFP, so they want you to be targeting treatment services, but there's still room for creativity in how you want to do that. 1B, here's the OVC partnership with BJA to specifically target victim services. And here's some of the other ideas that Tim and I were bouncing around. These are ones that they've specifically identified in the RFP, such as children's and family services, training for our first responders who may not be accustomed to some of the victimization issues that could be present, co-locate staff. This here, if your child welfare is in a wholly different department from, say, your court or your police department, you might want to consider having an office within the police department for victim services and children's services and child welfare and all of that. Training for your youth serving organizations. Here I envisioned like your Boys and Girls Club or your school, or maybe you have a culture camp that takes place in the summer. Here they said, you know, these kids, their parents might be suffering from addiction, and so you can provide training to the Boys and Girls Club about how to navigate some of those issues that their youth might be facing. And then finally, implement EBP, evidence-based program on parenting, trauma, mental health, peer support. This is where I would approach child welfare, children's services, your wellness courts, your court, all of those people. What is their wish list? What programs do they wish that they could offer that they don't right now? Because we could use this funding to implement those. Priority consideration, you'll notice the right one, our research plan. There's also priorities if you can show that your community has had a disproportionate impact because of opioids. Here we want local data if you had it, but it could be a cross-reference of both your tribal data and maybe your local municipality or county data, especially when we know some of our tribal members live and work off reservation but frequently come back. We have non-Indians that live and work on and off reservation. So sometimes having a cross-reference of data is useful. They also make a priority consideration for those of us willing to use the Overdose Detection Mapping Application Program. This is a specific tool to try and consolidate the different data points about overdose. So here the thinking is, okay, when the paramedics have an interaction with someone in an overdose, they keep data on that. When the police, when the hospitals, when the substance abuse treatment provider, you know, several weeks later, and the court, they all have these little data points on people that have suffered an overdose. And because they're all siloed, we only have an incomplete picture at best about what the actual overdose crisis is in our community. And so if your community can try and consolidate those data points, we might have a much more clear picture of what's going on. Easier said than done, but there's a specific tool to help use that. And if your community uses it or proposes to use it, you'll get priority consideration. So last year, this category was called the Overdose Outreach Project, and the BJA very helpfully provided little paragraph descriptions of what each of the grantees did with their funding. It's really interesting. And so I put just some examples here. For example, there was quite a bit of naloxone outreach projects. So this is the drug that helps combat the effects of an overdose. So there was lots of projects about, you know, just disseminating naloxone and training people on how to use it. The category is slightly different this year, predominantly the incorporation of victim services. And so it's not going to be a one-to-one comparison about what grantees did last year versus this year. Nevertheless, I think it's always useful to see what communities proposed in the past. So that's a link. But also, if you just Google BJA COAP, C-O-A-P, BJA has a website, and all of these different category descriptions of all of the grantees, they're on there. Really useful. Okay, category 2, no tribes, but I just wanted to put it on here so that you know what it is. Here they are trying to enable states to have a better grip on the use of technology for all of their treatment providers within the state, including, I thought a big thing here was telemedicine and monitoring medication-assisted treatment providers. I know a lot of tribes have been really concerned about that. And so if your state is one of the states funded on here, just wanted to put it on your radar so you could potentially reach out to them if you have any concerns about some of these issues within your state. Category 3.
Let me ask you a quick question. Hey, Lauren,
yeah.
Sorry, I hate to keep interrupting, but I'm so interested in the interactive part of this. I just want to kind of make mention of something. Even though the tribes can't apply because they can't be the unit of government, can they be the recipient of funds on that category? So in other words, a state can apply on behalf of a tribe or multiple tribes in a rural jurisdiction or setting, and then they would in turn be eligible to receive some of those services. So if you have a really great working relationship, or you like to extend or improve a relationship or work with someone at the state level to apply on behalf of the tribes, and that would be an area where you could receive some of those funds for technology and the other areas that were pointed on that slide.
Yeah, and even if you don't have a great relationship, it's worth reaching out because you are entitled to the services that your state's going to have access to should they get funded. And so for those of you, most states have a statewide drug court coordinator. They're all really good. Some are better than others about reaching out to tribes, but I'm pretty sure they all want to. If you don't know who your state drug court coordinator is, please contact me or ask in the questions box, and we can send you their contact information. They may or may not be directly involved in these applications, but they'll at least know who is and should be able to hook you up with information should you want it. Okay, category 3. This is a big fat category. Definitely put it on your radar. It's up projects for 36 months up to $900,000. Last year, it was called the System Level Diversion and Alternatives to Incarceration Project. This year, it's just diversion. I think in part it's because last year you could apply for drug court funding under this. This year, because there's the wholly separate adult drug court grant, you can't apply directly for drug court funding on here, but you can still support and supplement different pieces of your drug court through this category.
And just put in
so
a plug. Just put in a plug. The drug court solicitation received almost a doubling in their funding as well. So if you're really interested in applying in multiple areas of BJA funding, the drug court solicitation or appropriation was about $70 million versus 40 some last year, and veterans treatment courts went up to about $20 million on top of that.
Great point. So again, no pressure. These solicitations are due pretty much at the exact same time. So you're already going to be bogged down writing a grant. You might as well write 2. It's not like it's hard or anything. Just kidding. Good luck, everybody. Category 3, system level diversion. Here they've identified a number of different intercepts. This category makes specific reference to that sequential intercept model, which I encourage you to do in your proposal. Again, we have a project coordinator that we want, and we want to see a multidisciplinary planning team with a letter of support. If your wellness court has an MOU, that's the exact document that I would copy and update for my letter of support on my multidisciplinary team. Allowable uses of funding. They've got quite a few different ideas about what you can use here, which got my mind sparking a lot because I think a lot of these apply to our wellness court. Court-based interventions or family court programming. Again, lots of different EVPs here that we could go all over the place with. Recovery support. Universally screen. Oh my gosh, can you imagine if we screened not just people that we thought have a substance abuse or whose criminal activity involves substance use, for example, but just everybody? What if we screened everybody for if they needed services? Target treatment at a particular intercept. Peer recovery coaches. I see this as a really encouraged model all over the place, and I think it's a great idea about training our graduates to become peer recovery support specialists. This is a special training. It's not just an alumni association, but it's a specific, paid position that you could fund through this grant. Expand the availability of cognitive behavioral therapy and medication-assisted treatment. I think you could interpret this to be both on-site programs available in your clinic, but also through telemedicine. Here they make a specific shout out for wraparound services with child welfare, which is pretty neat because it can be lots of different things outside of just the typical substance abuse treatment. Partnering with public health to serve women and pregnant women. Here was another one of like, oh my gosh, I've received lots of technical assistance questions around substance-exposed newborns and services for women. You know, the old model used to be that, you know, you should just lock women up. We now know that not only is that an inhumane response, it's not a terribly effective response. And there's more research coming out now that for substance-exposed newborns, both the baby and the mom do better with increased contact as opposed to separating them immediately at birth. But we need lots more information and lots more resources in those areas. And data management information systems. I know for a fact that many of you are struggling with your data management systems. They're either woefully out of date if they exist at all, and they just don't have the capacity to handle just the court information you need, much less the ability to start to break down some of these silos between our agencies and the data that they hold. Priority consideration for those of us that are being disproportionately impacted. They had a couple of suggestions here on how you can demonstrate that. And then again, our research plan. So here, as I mentioned, last year's category was entitled slightly differently. And so I think you'll see slightly different projects that were funded last year. Nevertheless, I think last year's examples are also really good. And it was in this category that the one and only tribe was funded last year, Seneca Nation. They funded their peacemaking court. So I put that out there as, again, I think there's lots of creative approaches that you can use to fund under this category. And so here's just a couple examples of what communities were able to do under this funding. Category 4, again, no tribes, but just wanted to alert you so that you could hook up with your state if it is relevant. Here they want states to develop comprehensive plans for their whole state, which I think is a great idea. But I wanted to really highlight this because you're a part of your state, even though you're a separate sovereign. And so when they're identifying gaps in treatment, gaps in evidence-based programs, gaps in resources, I want you to make sure that you're letting your state know what your gaps are so that the state can build that into their plan and include you when they start disseminating resources to address those gaps. Category 5, again, no tribes, but just for, for your radar. This is from that 2002 prescription drug monitoring program. And so this is to help states set those up. You probably likely know if your state has one of these. Ideally they do. If they don't, we definitely want to encourage them because we've seen a lot of success when these come up. But a part of this solicitation is to help prove that they are in fact successful. So there's a large research component there that you may or may not be asked to participate in. Finally, category 6. This is a big fat one, up to $1 million. I put in parentheses $1.5 million for regions. It's unlikely that any tribe would qualify as a region. So I put it up there just because it's in the solicitation and you're going to see it, but I think tribes will likely only be eligible for up to the $1 million category. This is all about information sharing. Remember that category 6 comes from the same prescription drug court monitoring statute. And so in that vein, that's all about sharing data on who is prescribing opiates. This is all about sharing data from the different agencies, public health, behavioral health, and law enforcement. So as I mentioned, they want to leverage data. They want applicants to have a multidisciplinary group. Looks sort of similar to our wellness court, but they have a couple different agencies that they want to additionally participate on this. Specifically, let's see if I can, here we go. Law enforcement, the health department, our hospital, our clinic. I don't know if any tribes have medical or pharmacy boards, but if your county or state does, they might be worth just calling up to let them know that you wanted to apply for this, as well as if you had any forensic science laboratories on tribal lands or within the community that you have a relationship with. Sorry. There we go. So what are some permissible uses of funding? They want to see applicants use their data sets to develop strategies for a response. I mean, I think more than anything is when we pull the data together, what do we find? Again, there's those overdose detection mapping programs that I described in category 1. Implement data-driven responses, assess the impact. What happens when we have a clearer picture of what's facing our community? And here are the examples from last year. Again, a slightly different entitled category with slightly different objectives, but I still think a good example for how we might want to organize our proposal for this one. Performance measures. Don't think that just because you didn't want to do an action plan that you won't still be responsible for performance measures, because you will. They've got a couple of different links for performance measures. Tim, correct me if I'm wrong, but like other proposals, you aren't required to lay out all of the performance measures that you intend on collecting, but you do need to provide a plan for at least an idea of those performance measures that you want to collect.
That's exactly correct.
Okay, so you don't need to provide the data now because you don't have the data, you're not doing the project yet, you haven't been funded, but you do need to show that you've looked at these performance measures documents, that you know what they are, and that you have the capacity to collect these. I think that is especially true for those of us proposing for data management systems, which, you know, there it's a direct correlation. We're proposing to enhance our capacity to collect performance measures, but they really just want to see that you have an idea of what these are. They're all really straightforward. I was going to put them, lay them out here, but they're just exactly what you'd expect. That, you know, you want to track the easy stuff, like the number of meetings that you're going to have with your multidisciplinary team, but also when we're proposing, you know, to slow the opioid epidemic, how are we going to track that? Are we going to track it by the number of arrests, the number of naloxone admissions, the number of people that we engage with treatment, maybe even the number of people that graduate from wellness court? So just things like that, pretty straightforward. A couple application considerations. Each category has its own section in the solicitation for what they want to see in the problem statement, in the program narrative, in the capabilities and competencies. On the one hand, it was really intimidating when reading the solicitation, but on the other hand, they have just provided you your outline for how to do the proposal. So thank you, BJA. That actually makes writing this a little bit easier. Here are the different things that you should include, and I might even use those as my section headers. Make it really easy on the peer reviewers about here's what the opioid epidemic is nationally, in our state, in our local area. Here's the data that we have, or here's why we don't have data on this. I know as a peer reviewer, I always like to see, like, it's okay if you don't have the data, but just tell me why you don't have it. So those are just some examples. You can flip through it. It's in the second half of the application, broken up by each category. So that is the whole COAP proposal, at least as I read it. Hopefully this helped spark some creativity and some ideas about how you might want to approach this proposal. It's dripping with money, and so we hope that you can identify something that would be of use in your community, but particularly when it comes to the opportunities for evidence-based programming, victim services, enhancing your treatment providers and their services, whether it's, you know, through drug testing or curriculums or hiring a new treatment provider. all sorts of stuff. It can all fall within this proposal. So hopefully we got something on here. Wanted to identify a couple other funding opportunities that are available. As we've been talking about, there's the drug court program. We've got the link on there. I did a webinar just this Wednesday on it, so I will be posting that recording here in just probably this afternoon, so you can check that out if you missed it. There's also an OJJDP solicitation out, and that has funding for both juvenile and family drug courts. I know there are quite a few tribal grantees this year, and so they definitely fund tribes. Great solicitation. We actually partner with Children and Family Futures to provide the technical assistance for that. It's pretty comparable to BJA's, but slightly different for juvenile and family. And of course, it's due pretty much around the same time as their other ones. The Family First Prevention Services Act. This is really interesting. So for those of you who have Title IV-E funding, Congress has just expanded what you can use that funding for, including, quote, prevention services. So this includes health and substance abuse treatment services for families, even if they are still in home. It's just for at risk. So they don't even have to be removed from the home in foster care for you to be able to draw down funds to pay for substance abuse treatment. Really interesting. We are currently exploring the option for tribes that don't have Title IV-E. You know, Title IV-E, it used to be that you had to go through the state. You now can get direct agreements from the Children's Bureau, but we're also looking at, for tribes, particularly that aren't terribly interested in going through Title IV-E and the AFCARS timelines and all of that, if you could go through a tribe that has a Title IV-E agreement. It's technically allowed by the law, but we don't know of any tribes that have done that yet. But we're exploring it. Let us know if that seems interesting to you. But especially for tribes that do have Title IV-E, check this out. A couple wellness court resources that I want to highlight. We will be in Houston in just a couple of weeks here at the NADCP conference. We'll be doing the tribal track as well as hosting the Tribal Nations Forum. We hope to see you there. Mark your calendars, Healing to Wellness Court Enhancement Training, August 28th to 30th. It's actually going to be in Albuquerque, not Bernalillo. Apologies for that. But check out enhancementtraining.org. Today is the deadline for workshop proposals, so we'll be pulling those together and hopefully having a draft agenda for you to look at. But on that website, you can see the draft agenda and all of the materials from past trainings. So if you haven't been before, you can get a great idea of what's at those trainings. We'll also be at the California and Montana drug court trainings in the fall. Our publication series, of course, these are available online all the time for free for your use at this website, wellnesscourse.org. Pretty sure you're all familiar with this, but just in case you aren't, here it is. And a couple of other resources. This is a webinar that Tim, along with Tara, who pretty much drafted the entire solicitation that we just went over, they're going to be doing another webinar on the solicitation next Tuesday. So if you feel like you didn't get enough out of this one or have some additional questions, please tune into this one. This has the link on there. And then finally, here is my contact information. So if you have any questions, please type them in. We have Tim on the line, who is the horse's mouth over at BJA. So this is really a great opportunity if you have any questions regarding the solicitation. I want to show you this cute bear, but I'll go back to my contact information in case you have any, you wanted to jot that down. So,
and as Lauren said, oh, go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
No, as Lauren mentioned, we will have another webinar and another opportunity where we do a little bit of a deeper dive into the categories again. So if you are walking through the application and look at the different categories, you might have another opportunity to ask questions after you've developed your concepts. One of the things that you mentioned, Lauren, quite a few times throughout this particular webinar was to be coming up with a wish list, and I thought that was kind of very creative and genius, actually, because not only will you develop a wish list and look at the resource gaps, but then there's an area, hopefully, along the sequential intercept model of any of those 6 areas where a person would come into the criminal justice system, and then you could get services to assist with that. Just wanted to give you a really quick snapshot of last year. We received about 192 applications, and we funded 51. That's just over 50%, or 25%, excuse me, which is one of the largest percentages that we fund applications on our grants. We received $13 million, just recapping last year, and we're receiving $145 million this year. So we have a lot more funding, and we have a lot more opportunities for you to be thinking about those wish list items, putting together the resource needs, and figuring out where along the sequential intercept model that you'll need funding.
Yeah, the odds are good for my lottery players out there.
Julius, did you want to add at all to any of the other funding opportunities and streams that you're overseeing? If we don't have Julius, we'll certainly be able to reach out to him. You can reach out to me or Lauren regarding the other senior policy advisor and policy advisors portfolios, and we can get you responses to any questions for the other solicitations.
And I see we have one question from Jeff. Is there any way to assist or view the grant writing process if we are not in New Mexico? I'm not exactly sure what you mean. I, unfortunately, as a technical assistance provider, I'm able to provide the general assistance, but I can't do one-on-one consultation with your grant writing just because I don't have the capacity to do that for everyone. If you're talking about the enhancement training, we'll have some just general grant writing tips there. But I hope that was responsive, Jeff. Sorry if it wasn't. Okay. Any other questions? We're on the line here for you. Another question, is there any new substantial research on drug courts in Indian country since the 2014 publication of the key components? There's not, is the short answer. Not anything significant. Of course, the National Association of Drug Court Professionals has come out with their standards in 2013 and 2014. I think there are lots of great lessons learned that can be applied to tribes in there and should certainly be made reference to. In addition, the juvenile guidelines have come out for our juvenile drug courts. And then presently, the OJJDP and, or not OJJDP, but a couple of organizations, including TLPI, are helping to put together family drug court standards. They are still very much in the draft form, but will be discussed at both NADCP and the wellness court training in Albuquerque in August. We have another question. Will there be technical assistance provided if we can include, quote, action research in the application and are awarded? That's a great question. Tim, I assume that yes, there will be TA providers specific around the research component, but is that true?
Exactly. So I'm glad you mentioned that. And I didn't want to touch too much on that because we're going to introduce the COAP training and technical assistance portfolio throughout the next month or two with a new website. But yeah, even if you're not a grantee and you're considering those areas with a public, private, or research partnership or peer recovery support services, or just administering TA site-based, we have providers, 4 different training technical assistance providers to be specific that will be able to assist you. So once that website launches, you'll be able to go right onto that website and ask for your specific need. That's whether you're a grantee or not. So yes.
Cool. Yeah, because I think especially for those that are funded for action research, that's going to be a really involved process. And so having a TA provider to guide us through and just keep us on the right path, that'll be good. All righty. We've got a couple more minutes in case any other questions come to you.
While they're thinking of questions, do you want to cover any tips and tricks, or do we want to discuss like key areas where folks kind of miss the mark, or some things to be mindful of when putting the application together? And Lauren,
sure.
you served as a peer reviewer, right? You've served as a peer reviewer for us quite some time. What are there any things that you can think of that would be extremely helpful to say, hey, when I read this application, this was really stellar and it met the mark, and it really was one that was scored very highly regarding the other ones?
So that's an excellent point, Tim. So unlike CTAS, you're going to be competing against non-tribal sites. And so even though I'm familiar with Indian country, I know as a peer reviewer, I always appreciate applications that take the time to tell me a little bit about their community, especially if there are things that are unique about your tribe as compared to your neighboring municipality or county. And this is especially true when discussing sort of the makeup of who is in your service area, right? Like you may or may not have a jail. You may or may not have access to hospitals or clinics or treatment providers, or the makeup of who those are not necessarily all tribal. You might have collaborations with other jurisdictions. And so just taking the time to briefly lay that out for the peer reviewer is really helpful. Being organized and treating your proposal like a checklist is nice, because that's how your peer reviewers read these applications. They've got a list of things that they want to make sure is in your proposal. And so having it clearly identified with section headers is great. Keep in mind that your peer reviewer is accessing your proposal off of it's called the grant management system. It's a government website that's all secure, but it means that all that they see are the links to download your application. So whatever you named the file, that's all that they see. So be really thoughtful when you're naming the file. Put your tribal name, COAP Category 1, narrative, COAP, X tribe, COAP Category 1, budget, those types of things. Be really thoughtful about what you name your different pieces of your application. Consider PDFing it. It can be both a PDF or a Word document, but formatting always gets funky after it's been uploaded and downloaded a number of times, and so you're more likely to preserve your format with PDF. Resist the temptation to get smart with your formatting. 12-point font, Times New Roman, 1-inch margins. Stick to the page numbers. If it goes over, peer reviewers are instructed to throw away anything that's over, so you might as well not. And then, as much as possible, I mentioned this earlier, put in local data. Hook up with your court, hook up with your law enforcement, and see if you can get stats on the number of arrests, the number of cases. It does not have to be fancy. You don't need a PhD researcher to access that data, but I know as a peer reviewer, it shows like, okay, they've actually sat down and thought about this. But if your court doesn't have the capacity to, example, say, break down the drugs of choice, then you just note that. That's okay. But just the fact that you thought about it and said, boy, I wish I could provide this data, but we don't track that, that's okay. But just note that in your proposal. We have another question. I see that there was a webinar on healing to wellness course back in February. However, there seems to be a lot of crossover between that and this presentation. Is that accurate? Well, so the February webinar, that was actually on CTAS. the Coordinated Tribal Assistance Solicitation. That is a grant opportunity available for tribes and just for tribes offered by DOJ. So that's another great funding opportunity, but it is in fact different than this solicitation. This is the Comprehensive Opioid Abuse Program. On wellnesscourts.org, under our federal funding agencies and federal funding announcements, I attempt to break down the different wellness court related funding options that are out there. I've included BJA's COAP and I've included CPAS. And so hopefully that should help sort of break down the different funding options that are out there. But if you would like a further breakdown, I'm happy to email or chat with you. Okay, well, we're coming up on 12:15, so please feel free to continue to ask any questions. But if we don't have any more, we might release you all on this Friday.
Thank you. I appreciate it, Lauren. And it was a great webinar. It was very useful. I like the way you displayed all the information. If I can't mention enough, we have $145 million in 30 days for you guys to apply. I want to mention it at least 5 more times. I think it's extremely important also that what you said about thinking about wish list items and now having resources to meet those wish list items anywhere along those sequential intercept points, including those multiple themes and priorities. You're hitting child welfare, you're hitting youth and families affected, you're hitting rural communities, integrating technology, data-driven strategies. I mean, there's so many areas from soup to nuts, from the zero intercept when you're not even bringing them into the law enforcement area or into the law enforcement arena of criminal justice, to re-entry and bringing it back out safely. There's every option and possibility for you guys to receive funding and assistance. So thanks TLPI for putting this together. I think you, if I were there personally, I'd give you a round of applause. Folks that don't know, Lauren pulled this together literally probably within 24 hours after the announcement went on the street, and she put all of this useful information together for you. So please feel free to reach out to BJA or to Lauren or any one of us connected within the Office of Justice programs that might be able to help you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Tim. We really appreciate you joining us and helping us answer our questions. My pleasure in putting this together. I just want to make sure we get money to you all in Indian country doing the actual very difficult work. Please let me know if I can help you in any way. Yes.
Hey, Lauren, it's Jordan. Lee Green asked a question for Tim, if he can have
Yes.
his contact information.
Yes, so Tim's contact information is displayed on the screen. Hopefully you can see it. But for those of you that can't, his email is timothy.jeffries@usdoj.gov. All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Jordan, for supporting us on the back end. It is incredibly appreciated. She's been doing lots of work helping to monitor our chat boards and everything. And best of luck, everyone. For those of you attending NADCP, I look forward to seeing you in Houston. And if not, I hopefully will see all of you in Albuquerque for the enhancement training in August. Have a great Friday and take care.
Thank you.